Have you ever wondered what life was like in the Soviet Gulag? For many years, no one knew much about how hard life was in the Soviet prison camps. But the truth is slowly coming to light. In this video, we will explore the untold history of the Soviet Gulag, including its origins, the brutal conditions of life within the camps, and the legacy of the Gulag today. But before we start, please give a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. The word Gulag comes from the Russian phrase main camp administration. After the Russian Revolution of 1917, Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, took control of the government. When Lenin passed away from a stroke in 1924, Joseph Stalin stepped up to the plate and ascended to rule Russia with an iron fist. Under Lenin's rule in 1919, the Gulag was born, and by 1921, it already held 84 camps. However, it wasn't until Stalin took over that the prison population boomed. From 1929 until the dictator's death, the Gulag went through an impressive growth spurt. Uncle Joe saw the camps as a clever way to help industrialize the Soviet Union and get their hands on precious natural resources like coal, minerals, and timber. During Stalin's Great Purge, people who opposed the leader and his Communist Party were locked up in the Gulag camps. This was a horrible way to silence any voices of disagreement. That is exactly what the Gulag was intended for. It wasn't made to punish criminals. Instead, it was a way for the government to keep the whole country under control. Millions of innocent people were wrongfully jailed and mistreated because of this evil plan. This plan has made it one of the darkest moments of the 20th century. Millions of unfortunate people were sent to the Gulag, where they were forced to work hard for 5 to 20 years. In the camps, they were put to work in the fields and mines, oftentimes with no access to adequate clothing, tools, shelter, food, or drinkable water. We'll never know how many perished from starvation, sickness, violence, and freezing temperatures. The number of deceased is simply too large to calculate. Even though many more people were held in the Gulag for much longer periods of time than in Nazi concentration camps, the Gulag is still not as well known. Even the farmers couldn't get away from it. From 1930, the Soviet imposed a new rule. Farmers were forced to surrender all grain to the government. If anyone opposed this rule and kept any for themselves, they had been charged with hoarding and faced the government's wrath. In the same way, the term kulak, which literally means fist, was applied to any prosperous farmer who was suspected of using non-Soviet techniques to raise his crops and livestock. Just owning a single cow was sufficient evidence for labeling farmers as anti-Soviet. Between 1930 and 1933, more than 2 million farmers were transported to Siberia, and another 100,000 were placed on the Gulag. Arrests for anti-Soviet behavior had been consistent year after year. Yet, the killing of Sergei Kirov, the head of the Communist Party in Leningrad and a close friend of Stalin's, was the spark that set off a fire of mass arrests and executions that killed thousands. On the night of the murder, Stalin yelled that everyone involved in anti-Soviet terrorism should be put to death. From July 1937 to November 1938, there was a reign of terror whose only goal was to get rid of anyone who was seen as a threat to the Soviet government. The first people to be arrested and put in jail for counter-revolutionary activities were Communist Party members. Then their families were arrested, and then the general public. It was so terrifying that it was dubbed the Great Terror throughout history. In penal colonies, there were two types of prisoners. 1. Those who have committed serious crimes that will result in prosecution in most nations, such as murder, rape, or robbery. Even in the camps, these repeat offenders persisted in their criminal ways, such as stealing supply trucks of their contents before they could distribute clothing or food. 2. Individuals whose crimes are so trivial that they are not considered criminal in other countries. Petty thievery, like stealing bread from a restaurant's kitchen to feed one's children, was included in this category of crimes. The vast majority of inmates in the Gulag system were people labeled as criminals, and they were given terms of 8 to 10 years of hard labor. Their trials lasted a maximum of 5 minutes. How ironic. In the group of political prisoners, there were people who were opposed to Soviet rule. Most of them, however, were thrown in prison and handed terms after being falsely labeled anti-Soviet. Politically motivated convicts never exceeded 25% of the overall population. But what about the wives and children of the inmates? they also faced consequences. When married men were imprisoned in the Gulag, their wives and children were also mistreated. They thought that their friends and fellow citizens might go against them. In some cases, their wives were in more of a dreadful situation than themselves. Frequently, spouses would lose their jobs and homes and be forced to sell their belongings. They could only rely on infrequent work or the generosity of others. Many wives had no idea where their husbands had been taken to prison. If both parents were in jail, the children were sent to live with relatives in another city or put in orphanages. Teachers were careful not to be too friendly with them because they didn't want to seem like they liked the enemies. In less than a year, 15,347 children were taken into orphanages as a result of parents arrested during the Great Terror. Babies who were born in concentration camps spent their first 2 years with their mothers before being sent to orphanages. Let us now look at the prisoners' lives. The lives of the prisoners were quite pathetic. Prisoners in the Gulag were used for massive building, mining, and manufacturing projects. The kind of business that ran out of the camp depended on where it was and what was needed in the area. The Moscow-Volga Canal, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, and the Kolnya Highway were all large Soviet projects that used Gulag labor crews. Inmates were only provided basic, flimsy tools with no protective gear. Some of the employees spent their days using hand saws and pickaxes to cut trees and dig into the freezing ground. Some worked in mines for coal or copper, others dug dirt by hand. To get out of the hard work, the slaves often hurt themselves by cutting their hands with axes or sticking their arms in a wood furnace. Prisoners in the camp often had to work in bad weather, even when the temperature was below zero. Working hours were long, and food supplies were limited. Food allotments were contingent on inmates meeting their job requirements. Temperatures in the gulags were low, and the housing conditions were congested and unclean. When workers tried to fight back, guards would often attack them or even shoot them. Many workers died from exhaustion or these attacks. Historians believe that at least 10% of the entire Gulag population was killed each year. After serving their time in the Gulag, prisoners who made it out alive were free to go. A suspected traitor's family members, for instance, might face a minimum of 5 to 8 years in prison. Some prisoners may have been able to get out early if they worked very hard and far more than their quotas required. Annual Gulag releases ranged from 150,000 to 500,000 between 1934 and 1953. But everything has an end. The Gulag was dismantled soon after Stalin's death in 1953. Over 1 million inmates were freed within days. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, spoke out against the dictator's mass incarceration and purge programs, as well as most of the other things he did. However, the concentration camps did not go away entirely. Some of these buildings were used as prisons in the 1970s and 80s for criminals, democratic activists, and anti-Soviet nationalists. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev began the process of closing the camps for good in about 1987. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, did the world understand the full magnitude of the Gulag system's crimes? Films and photographs were taken inside European concentration camps during World War II, but not within the Gulag. The Russian historian Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who himself survived the Gulag, wrote the book The Gulag Archipelago. In 1973, it was released to the general public in Western Europe and North America. Even though it was only available in a few illegal copies in the Soviet Union at the time, this important book showed how harsh the country's prison system was, which had terrible effects on the families of those who were locked up. Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1970, but the Soviet Union kicked him out in 1974, and he didn't go back to Russia until 1994. The terrible Gulag has broken and destroyed generations of Russians. Some of the surviving victims are still too traumatized to talk about their experiences. That's all for today. We have more interesting videos for you.